Hey friends, this is the Theology Mill from Whitford Publishers. I'm your host, Zach Mickle. Thank you for taking the time to listen today. On this episode, I got to chat with Dr. Alvyn Pettersen about the second-century Christian apologists and specifically about Dr. Pettersen's Cascade Companion on this group of thinkers and letter writers. Dr. Pettersen is also Canon Theologian Emeritus of Worcester Cathedral in the UK and an Honorary Chaplain at the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin in Oxford. He has written widely in the field of patristics and is the author of Athanasius and the Human Body, a volume on Athanasius in the series Outstanding Christian Thinkers, and of course, as we discuss here, the Cascade Companion on the Second-Century Apologists. If you want to stay in the loop with what we're doing on the Theology Mill, you can follow us on X or on YouTube, or you can subscribe to our newsletter, and we'll send you monthly news and book deals on that newsletter. So see the links in the show notes below to learn more about each of those. And if you're feeling generous, a 5-star rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts always goes a long way, so thanks for that. And now we'll head over to our conversation with Dr. Pettersen. As always, I hope you enjoy this episode, and thank you so much for listening. All right, I am here today with Dr. Alvyn Pettersen, author of the Cascade Companion to the Second-Century Apologists. So, Alvyn, thank you so much for joining us on the Theology Mill today. To begin, could you share with our listeners just maybe a bit about yourself and your work?
Yes, I'm an Anglican priest. I was until recently the Canon Theologian of Worcester Cathedral in the UK, and I've now come back to Oxford, where formerly I was a chaplain of one of the colleges and a lecturer in theology, lecturer in patristics. I'm one of those priests for whom I suppose the altar and a library are hugely important. I sometimes think that without one or the other, my life would be less rich because I find presiding at the altar, being a priest to people, enriches my research and my writing and research invigorates my priestly ministry.
Mm.
I'm someone who's written a number of books, primarily on the Greek fathers, um, especially on the 4th century Bishop of Alexandria, Athanasius. But the latest book, the book that has just been mentioned, is one that came as a result of, I was very interested in, if you wish, the history of ideas from the understanding of Jesus in the New Testament to, shall we say, the understanding of Jesus Christ in the 4th century Council of Nicaea. But it always had seemed something of a sort of stepping stone when you came to the second century apologists. And I thought they must surely be working in a context. What is driving their theology? What is informing it? What are the questions they're trying to answer? And at long last, my curiosity got the better of me and I put pen to paper.
Mm.
So that's
Mm.
me.
No, yeah, thank you for all of that. Okay, so before we kind of get into your book and talking about the second
Mm,
century apologists, we always start every episode with our Theology Mill opener question. So the question is, if you could have dinner with any one thinker or any one person, they can be dead or alive. It could be a philosopher, a theologian, a family member. It doesn't have to necessarily be an intellectual, though. Of course, that's totally fine. If it is, typically that's how people respond on the show. But if it's not, that's more than welcome too. But who would you choose? Who would this one person be? And then what's one burning question that you would maybe most want to ask that person?
right. Because of what we're talking about today, I thought to myself, the person that I'd particularly like to have my dinner party is someone called Polycarp. Polycarp was the bishop of Smyrna, modern day Izmir in Turkey, and he was arrested and martyred in 156. He's brought to the amphitheatre, and there he was told he had to swear by the genius of the emperor. He had to say that Caesar is Lord, where in the martyrology the word that is used is Kyrios, Lord, the very term that Christians used of Jesus. He was asked to perform sacrifices to the local cult and deny the atheists, by which the prosecutor meant Christians, those who denied the gods of the empire. And he refused these, and he has this wonderful line, or at least the writer of the Martyrology has a wonderful line where Polycarp is said to have replied, "For 86 years I've been Christ's servant, and he's done me no wrong whatsoever. So how can I blaspheme my King and my Saviour?" But of course, before he came to the amphitheatre, he had to be found and arrested. He knew he was being sought, but initially he decided to stay at home in Smyrna. His advisors said, "No, you must slip away," and eventually he was persuaded to slip away. He went to a small estate on the outskirts of the city. There he stayed for about 3 days, and while there, while praying, he has this vision. And in the vision, he believes that he's led to understand by God that he's going to die by being burnt to death. Nevertheless, he still is persuaded to move away. He goes to a second, if you wish, hiding place. He has the opportunity of moving yet again, but he chooses not to. And there he's eventually arrested and, as I said, brought to the amphitheatre. Now, the question that I would have of Polycarp is, why didn't you move initially? Why did you choose not to move before your advisors said to? Because there was a tradition at that time and much later that it was not right for Christians to volunteer for being tried as a Christian and probably being martyred. And once you discovered that you were going to be martyred, why did you run away again? So, why do different things? What advice, for example, would you give a Christian who, almost to quote Polycarp, when faced with the demands of cursing Christ, betraying the and blaspheming against their King and Savior, what advice would you give those people? Should they stay? Should they run away? Should they hide? Should they engage in debating with their prosecutors? Those are the sort of questions that I'd love to hear Polycarp answer over my dinner table.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. Okay. No. Okay, so let's turn to the second century apologists and to your book. So, if you could maybe just tell us a little bit about these second century apologists. Who were these figures, and what was sort of their purpose in writing as they did?
Yeah. Um, we're aware of 6 apologists. They're writing roughly in the second half of the second century. The first person that we are aware of is a person called Aristides. He writes in about 145, and one of the latest is the Bishop of Antioch, Theophilus by name, and he's writing in about 180. It's a time when the Greco-Roman Empire is largely at peace. I say largely, there are outbursts of violence occasionally. 2 of the letters are sent to particular individuals answering particular questions. So, for example, we have an anonymous letter to someone called Diognetus, and Diognetus wants to know, who's the Christian God? How do Christians worship their God? Is Christianity new? So that anonymous letter writer is answering very particular questions. But 4 of the 6 writers are writing, at least nominally, to the emperor, trying to address accusations made against Christians of the time that they are atheists, i.e., that they deny the gods of the empire, that they're involved in cannibalism, and that they're involved in incest. And those are the people. And the replies drawn up by these various people are that they want to counter charges which they think, if they are found guilty of these, there will be a miscarriage of justice. And I have to say, I would want to nuance that a little and say that incidentally, there's also not only a wanting to say to these people, their audience, give them a better understanding of Christianity. But in a sense, by giving that understanding, to be engaging in something about persuading these people, really, you would be better if you forsook your ways and joined us and worshiped the one true God.
So, I mean, what was kind of the nature of these writers as a group? Were they companions and friends? Were they, I mean, obviously they were somewhat contemporary with one another, but were they, living in the same area, in contact with each other? Like, were they sort of collaborating in any way, or were they sort of disparate figures who were kind of doing their own thing that happened to be in the same sort of vein? So, in other words, like, would it be
Mhm.
accurate to think of this as a sort of movement or as an intellectual circle, or how might you describe it?
I mean, I think one of the challenges for us is that they're writing letters. And so letters are not, um, well, they're focused on particular things. I know that letters at that time, and indeed sometimes public letters nowadays, are to be read by a wider public and so on and so forth. But it's a bit difficult to, because we're dealing in letters, to say, oh, yes, they're a group. And they're
Mhm.
drawn from a whole geographical area, mainly from the um, eastern end of the Mediterranean basin. But for example, we've got Justin. Justin is born in Nablus in Samaria. He comes via Ephesus to Rome, where he establishes a theological school. We have Tatian. Tatian comes from east of the Euphrates. He comes to Rome and, in fact, studies with Justin. But Justin and Tatian are almost as different as chalk and cheese. We have Theophilus, who I mentioned, who's the bishop of Antioch, and he's essentially based there. And then we have two other people, Aristides and Athenagoras, who are based in Athens. So, I mean, in modern day terms, they're not far apart. But in second century terms, geographically, they're miles apart. And their ideas, although there's a certain coherence, I don't think one can easily say, oh, yes, they collaborated. Certainly, Justin and Tatian are very unhappy partners. Um, so I think it's very difficult to say, yes, they were um, a group, that they were united in what they were doing, other than their common aim is to uh, establish the truth of Christianity and the rightness of their beliefs against these accusations being leveled against them.
So, I mean, outside of sort of their letters, do we have any other sources for kind of piecing some of these things together? Like, are there I don't know, historical accounts or from Eusebius or any other kind of sources that we're able to work with aside from the letters, or is it just pretty much the letters is what we have?
It's pretty much the letters, with the exception of Justin Martyr. Justin, I mean, in the case of the other writers, the letters are very specific. In the case of Justin, he writes two apologies and he writes a third piece to a Jew called Trypho. Um, in that sense, we have a larger corpus of material. Um, there are obviously references in Eusebius, the ecclesiastical history, to Justin. There's references to Tatian. He's never particularly loved by subsequent writers. But in one sense, one of our challenges is that we're dealing with this group that avail themselves of a period of relative stability when Christians feel that they can put their heads above the parapet and can seek to make a justification why Christians act and um, pursue a way of life which is different and not entirely accepted, well, more than not entirely accepted, or quite often resisted by other people. But with the exception of one or two instances, Christians are not persecuted for their beliefs at that time.
Mhm. So looking at these figures, I mean, what would you say are maybe some of the features that they share in common, or that their letters, their thinking shares in common? And then what are maybe you spoke of some of them being kind of unhappy partners and so forth. So what are maybe
Mm,
also kind of one or two significant differences, or maybe just kind of distinct inflections among the six in this group?
yeah. Um, I suppose some of the commonalities between them are that they strongly hold that their beliefs, even where they differ, are the truth over against what they're being accused of being. So they will maintain that, yes, they are atheists at least in the sense of they don't recognize that the gods worshipped in the cult of the empire are gods, that there's only one God. Generally speaking, maybe with the exception of someone like Tatian, they are strongly of the persuasion that that one God, the God of the Christian tradition, is the maker and sustainer of the material world. And it surfaces in a variety of ways, but I suppose one of the main ways that it surfaces is they will severally put forward the argument that the world is made, and if it is made, there must be a maker. And that maker ultimately is the Creator God. And that Creator God is therefore the only one who can be worshipped, even when it comes to the emperors, for whom Pliny, for example, and indeed, as I mentioned with regard to Polycarp, when people are invited to worship the emperor or swear by the genius of the emperor or say Caesar is Lord, um, these people will be of a common mind that no, the emperor and everything else is made. It is made and therefore not be worshipped. But because it is made by God, it is to be honored where it is behaving in an appropriate fashion. So the emperor is, for example, not to be worshipped, not to be prayed to, but he is to be prayed for. The governor that questions Polycarp in the amphitheater in Smyrna in 156 is someone whom Polycarp says, because you, amongst the others in authority, have been put in authority by God, we will obey your rules in all that is just and right. So there's a sense in which these people are to be honored, but not to be honored blindly. There are some of those sort of similarities. But equally, there are some major differences. So, for example, um, Tatian, when it comes to philosophy, Tatian believes that really there is only one true philosophy, and that's Christianity. If you take someone like Justin, Justin says, well, Christianity is the true philosophy, but those truths have been borrowed, or at least some of them have been borrowed by Greek philosophy. And so he talks in terms of we can see in Greek philosophy truths, but not the whole truth. That allows for him to say, for example, we can therefore have a dialogue with Greek philosophy. We can have a recognition that there's elements of truth. We can use some of the philosophical models in our development of our conversations. Indeed, Justin goes sufficiently far in contradistinction with Tatian, and Tatian, as I said, essentially says there's only one true philosophy, and that's Christianity. Justin is prepared to say, but there are Christians before Christ, people like Abraham, people like Socrates, people like Heraclitus. So there's one example where there's a major difference of opinion between, admittedly, the two people who were never going to be good friends. Um, but that sense of some of the apologists, people like Theophilus as well, people like Athanasius, they are equally prepared to say there are truths which can be found in philosophy, in Greek philosophy, which can be recognized as having been borrowed from the revelation by either the Spirit or by the Word of God. And by the Word of God, they mean what is eventually titled in, shall we say, Nicaea as the Son of God, consubstantial with the Father. I suppose some of the other differences is, and again, it's most marked but not exclusively, not exclusive to Tatian, all of them believe that as it were, the end time will come. There's just no quibbling about that whatsoever. And indeed, that becomes part of the argument about why Christians will behave in particular ways. They will behave that way because the end time is worse than suffering the penalties now. Suffer death now rather than a perpetual death in the end time. Tatian virtually uses that as a threat to bounce people into the kingdom of God. Someone like the anonymous letter writer to Diognetus says, yes, the end time will come, but God is not one of these gods who will force or compel belief. Witness, for example, the birth of the infant Jesus. He comes as a child. Why does he come as a child? Because he comes to persuade. And for that anonymous writer and for Theophilus, there is that sense in which the end will come, but there's that period of gracious patience, that period of wishing to persuade people, to almost to woo people into orthodox belief, orthodox practice. So those are some of the differences between these various people.
Sure. Yeah, no, I'm interested. You spoke about the what you kind of called, I think, the gracious period of patience, right? Sort of a lingering time for folks to be convinced of the truthfulness of the Christian faith. I mean, was there sort of an imminent sense of the end times for some of these figures? Like, were the end times sort of thought of as something right around the corner for some of these?
No, I mean there's not that sense of you might even wake up tomorrow and you'll be sort
Mhm.
of involved in the end time. What there is there's I mean it just doesn't feature as such, but it does feature in a very graphic way in the sense that when I mean to take again the example of Polycarp quite clearly, or more particularly the martyrology of Polycarp's life and death, quite clearly does say, I would much prefer, in fact, I have no choice between the temporary fire of being burnt in the amphitheatre in Smyrna over against the eternal fire of the end judgment. So there's that immediacy. It's very graphic, if you wish, but there's not that sense of we're in the end times immediately. But there is that sense of what we do now, especially if we're sinful, will be picked up. I mean, so for example, when there's arguments about, well, when there's the defense uh, of made by Christians against the charges of being cannibals, one of the defenses which is made, not the only defense, and in one sense it's one of the lesser defenses, but one of the defenses which is made is that we wouldn't engage in cannibalism. It's an awful sin. And what is worse is the penalty for that sin is endless punishment. And implicit
Mhm.
in that is,
Mhm.
therefore, better to be found falsely guilty of cannibalism than to be found open to the penalty of eternal punishment.
Sure. Okay. Okay. So they were sort of offering a defense of the faith in the face of these very misguided kind of accusations about what the early Christians were up to. But Were there any kind of missional aspects to the second century apologist writings? Like, were they in any way were their writings in any way apologetical in the ways that we sort of think of that term today? In other words, like, how does the work of these apologists, since they're called apologists, how does that sort of stand in relation to the domain that we would label apologetics? Are these distinct and different things? Are they similar in certain ways?
Yeah. Can I just come back before I'm very happy to reply to that question about mission and apologetics. You use the phrase misguided. I think that needs to be unpacked a little, misguided
Sure.
accusations, because quite clearly, um, at least with regard to Christian attitude towards the gods of the empire, they were atheists. They just couldn't deny that they were atheists.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't prepared to worship the gods of the empire. And at that period, if you didn't worship the gods of the empire, or this is what was believed by many of the people living there, you were open to offending the gods, and you were therefore likely to disturb the peace of the gods. And if you disturb the peace of the gods would become angry with you, and the peace that you were then enjoying, whether locally or across the empire, would also be upset. There was a sense of we must scratch the backs of the gods so that we can uh, enjoy the peace and prosperity we're currently enjoying, or at least not suffer worse than we currently are. And when it came to cannibalism and incest, one's got to remember that these are people who are not allowed to inquire closely as to what happens in Christian religion, because the only people who can attend a Eucharist are baptized communicant members of the church. So, in a sense, it's a quote, secret, unquote, society where rumors are coming out that these people are eating the body and blood of someone, that they're encouraged to love everyone, to kiss one another, a reference to the kiss of peace at the Eucharist, and so on and so forth. So you can see how, through misunderstanding in the case of cannibalism and incense, and through the public actions of Christians vis-a-vis atheism, these are, from their perspective, not misguided. Clearly, from the
Mm-hmm.
Christian perspective, they are. Um, And in a sense, that's where the whole issue of, how can we put it, mission, that sort of thing, is to my mind quite a significant fact. Now, mission, I don't think for the apologists, maybe with one exception, is not a deliberate purpose, but it comes as a consequence of their defenses. Let me explain what I mean by that. Society was not really aware of what um, Christians believe, what the Christian faith was. So I suppose there's a sense in which the apologists are seeking to allow people to understand more fully what Christians at that period, or the apologists at that period, would understand to be the truth of God, and a truth which is to be lived. So it's a lived faith. That's quite important. And it's to be lived by everyone, because at the time, there's a sense in which philosophy and religion was often a pursuit of the elite. The general public, if I can put it that way, were engaged in the rituals. Doctrine meant little to them. And I suppose they also wanted to warn people about the judgment at the end time. So there was that mission dimension. I mean, again, taking up that anonymous letter writer to Diogenetus, he's hoping, when he's answering the questions that Diogenetus, at least formally, is putting him, who is God? The author wants to say, this is the Christian God, and I want you to come and know him. And I want you to admire those who are punished for denying the gods of the cult. And he wants people, the same Diogenetus, to come and in fact, condemn what Christians at that stage were deeming to be the world's errors. More generally, I think there's a sense in which there's two audiences. There's the audience to whom the apologists are writing, but there's also, in a sense, the Christian audience who are looking over the shoulder of the letter writers, who are learning through that process loyalty to God in a contingent world, how to live rightly and godly lives in late second century Hellenistic society, how to make possible replies to those who are criticizing Christians. And in a sense, to come back to something we've talked about just a little earlier, that sense of patience between the incarnation and the end time, that gracious period of patience, it's saying something about not only that there should be mission, but how mission is to be done. You're not to compel people into the kingdom of God. I mean, Tatian would disagree with me there. But generally speaking, you're not to force people in. You're to imitate God in terms of being merciful, not condemning the obdurate sinner, and so on and so forth. So those are some of the background, if I could put it that way, to
Hmm.
the sense of mission. Now, you asked about apologetics. I think one of the big differences here, uh, by here I mean with regard to the apologists and contemporary apologetics, is that at that time in the second century, all life is religious. The debate really is about which religious life is to be lived. You just can't, in the second century, get away from the fact that religion of the cult of the empire impinged on school, on work, in terms of the market. For example, the meat that was sold in the marketplace, more often than not, had already been used for sacrifices in the temples. So, in that sense, it was deemed by Christians to be not appropriate to buy, let alone to eat. Um, the cult influenced ceremonies on high days and holy days. It colored all those periods that bind society together, the celebration of births, of marriages, and death. So that's one factor. The second factor, which we need to bear in mind, is when Christians were being accused of being atheists, what the accusers wanted was not conversion from Christianity to the gods of the cult. They wanted worship to be of the cult gods and, if you wish, of Christ as well. So there was a sort of universalism, inclusivism there. Now, in our society, both in the States and in Europe, there is quite a radical divide between church and state, between religion and secular society. So, in that sense, it's quite different. I suppose one of the places where I suppose it isn't so different is with reference to that underlying theme of the apologists that what is made should not be worshipped. And when that is seen in terms of the whole host of things, the people in power should not be worshipped. The way in which society should respect those less fortunate themselves, that people should maintain fidelity, especially, for example, within um, relationships, which is one of the reasons why the Christians were so incensed at the charge of being engaged in incestuous behavior. What was at stake there was not just issues of promiscuity, but the issue of what is the role of faithfulness within a society. And by society, I don't mean just a collection of individuals, I mean a community. How you deal with your neighbor, how you deal with your relatives, how you deal with those in authority, and so on and so forth.
Hmm. So yeah, no, thank you for all of that. You mentioned earlier a bit about Greek philosophy and
Mm,
how these six figures sort of grappled,
mm, mm,
or at least some of them grappled with sort of the importance or the truthfulness of Greek philosophy or its compatibility or incompatibility with the Christian faith. And from my understanding, of course, you're the expert, and I'm certainly not on this, but they were maybe some of the first Christian intellectuals to kind of start reckoning with the faith's relationship to philosophy, especially to ancient Greek philosophy. So, what were maybe some of the differing approaches? I know you've gotten into this a bit already,
mm.
but what were maybe some of the differing approaches of these figures, kind of regarding that relationship between philosophy and the Christian faith?
I think one has got to remember that faith at that time was deemed to be by non-Christians as the lowest form of cognition. One's also got to remember what I've just said, namely that there is not an obvious divide between religious and secular. So, of course, philosophy for them, as as the very word suggests, is love of wisdom. And for Christians, the only wisdom that there truly is that which is revealed by the word, the logos. Um, so philosophy, strictly speaking, for them, is the love of the revelation of God through His Word, the Word that is the creative word of Genesis, the Word that reveals itself in and through Jesus and through the prophets and through Moses and so on and so forth. So that distinction between philosophy and faith is a slightly ambiguous one. Ambiguous, at least from our perspective. But as I mentioned, someone like Justin can say there are Christians before Christ. Why are they Christians before Christ? Because they are the true philosophers, to appropriate Tatian's phrase with regard to Christianity being the only true philosophy. There are many points at which these people will say we disagree with the philosophy of the time, but there are points at which they're more than ready to take it forward. Let me give you at least one example, and I mean, if you wish, press me for others.
Mhm.
In at that period, as a result of the thinking of people like Pythagoras and others, all numbers originated in the number one. There was no zero. So behind the many, there is the one. And in Greek philosophy of the period, there is therefore that simple being, the monad, if you wish. Now, that allows these people of the time to say, behind the many things which are made, there will be the one maker. It allows them to say, behind what is made, there is the one God. And that allows, therefore, that monotheistic religion to trade, if you wish, on that theory of number. And of course, it trades on it in one other way, and that is if all numbers originate in the number one, there's no zero. So therefore, there's not the possibility of there not being a God or not being a monad. The debate then really is, who is that one? Is it a sort of abstract, distant one? Or is it, as for these people, and not exclusively for these people, these Christians, is it someone who has some relationship with the world which we know, the world which they believe has been made by this one God? Um, so we're not dealing with a deity who is distant and alien, and in Neoplatonic terms, that you know, uh, 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 the alone person, the sole person, seeks to be alone with the alone. It's very much more a case of this God is to be worshipped, but because he has made this world, he is to be worshipped in this world and through this world. And so you can have sacramentality, you can have the celebration of the Eucharist, you can and should have attitudes which are about respecting the person who is weak, the orphan, and so on and so forth. So those would be some of the ways. But as I also said a little earlier with Justin, but is true for Athenagoras, is true for Theophilus, there are elements of truth within Greek philosophy where they have borrowed, and they have borrowed from what has been revealed by God's word through Moses, through the prophets, the Hebrew prophets. And that allows, for most of them, the possibility of engaging in dialogue, to using some of those models. For example, that idea of the one, but there are others which I could speak of if you want to press me, to allow them to engage in that conversation. Without those common factors, that common ground, of course, it would have been simply one side, in a sense, speaking but not being heard by the other, and the other side speaking and not being heard by the first side.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we do have time if you'd like to share any of those other examples, if you happen to have them
Yeah,
ready to
yeah,
hand.
yeah, yeah. One of the ones which most listeners would probably be aware of is the idea of Justin picking up the idea of, in Greek, it's the logos endiathetos and logos propharokos. It's a Stoic anthropological idea of thought as innate rationality and innate rationality expressed. I suppose the way that we might put it is the difference between a thought being held in one's mind and that thought being expressed. And there's obviously continuity in Stoic thinking, and for Justin, continuity between the thought and the word expressed. But Justin will press it and say, but when the thought is expressed and becomes a word, it's not that the thought is extinguished, it's not that the thought is diminished, it's not that when I express my idea that somehow it has left me and I'm diminished, I'm lessened, nor has the idea somehow become uh, aggrandized as a result of it being spoken. I haven't been added to by this word having been spoken, and that allows Justin to move from the idea that, in some sense, the word is the Son of the Father. Now, we have to be very careful here because we haven't really got a developed Binitarian, let alone a Trinitarian theology at this stage. But there is worship of Christ as the Son of God. But it allows him to engage the philosophy of the time by saying that just as a word which is thought and then uttered, there's continuity and discontinuity, or distinction would be a better way of putting it. So when you have God and his word, the word that is then sent forth as the creative word, the word that then is spoken in Revelation, there is continuity and distinction between what later will be known as the first person of the Trinity and the second person of the Trinity. But I have to caveat that by saying, that Trinitarian thinking has not been developed to any substantial degree at this stage.
Mhm. I want to turn to this question of sort of the second century apologists being really insistent that Christianity was not new, right? So for
Yeah.
instance, in your book in chapter 3, you write, I'm going to just very briefly quote a short sentence of yours from the book. You write,
Mm,
the
mm,
mid to late second century apologists were adamant that Christianity was one, not new, and two, was true.
mm.
So I wanna especially look at that aspect of it being not new. So what did these thinkers sort of mean in claiming that Christianity was not new? And then why was this important for them to make this claim?
I suppose that the thinking that it was new, as suggested by the people of the time, was that in comparison with Judaism, from which Christianity at this point, to some extent, was still uh, making itself distinct, Judaism was deemed to be a very ancient religion. And so, in some sense, Christianity looked new in those terms. But at the time, there was also quite a sense that what was new was not true. It was suspect. It was something which had not yet stood the test of time. It had not been authenticated, and so on and so forth. At best it was provisional. And that's an idea which, for example, Justin in particular, in one of his apologies, he quite clearly addresses, and he says, yes, Christ did come late in time. Indeed, it's only very recently that he was crucified. And he says to his readers, you can go and check this out. It's very recent. But Christianity wants to say that may be true, that Jesus was crucified relatively recently, but that crucifixion for them, they say, has been foretold by the Hebrew prophets, who are the very people upon whom the word of the Lord came. I mean, they're almost using, but that sort of phrasing that you get in the Jewish scriptures of the word came to the prophet X, and the prophet says. Um, so what Justin is wanting to say is, yes, Jesus is very new, but he's the end of a very ancient revelation. So its comparative novelty is not a reflection on its truthfulness. Now, of course, the question then arises is, but why is what are the arguments that can be put forward for the truth of Christianity? And I suppose there are two main types of replies, and it depends on the audience. For people who recognize the authority of the Jewish scriptures, then those can be used. So Theophilus, that bishop of Antioch, writing to Autolycus, and he's writing to a person in a society where Hellenistic Judaism is very strong, and Theophilus therefore leverages both the Decalogue and Matthew's Gospel as some of the evidence that he's going to bring forward. And Justin, in his letter to Trypho, does much the same. And in a sense, that's where authority lies for those two people, or by people I mean the recipients of the letter. But of course, for the wider society, the Jewish scriptures, I mean, they're there, but they don't have the authority. So the argument there that is brought forward is, well, an argument from lifestyle. The people who are the Christians who are speaking to you and to me are quite unimpressive people. In fact, uh, at certain points, they pick some of the major figures from the Old Testament. They pick people like Moses. Moses, of course, when he's told in the Exodus tradition to go and speak to Pharaoh, he says, "But I, I'm slow of speech. I'm not eloquent. I can't speak well." And God in the tradition says, "Okay, we'll send you and we'll send Aaron." They mention David, King David. King David, just a shepherd. They mention Jeremiah, who, when he's called, he turns to God and says, "But I'm only a boy." So, in a sense, there's something that the apologists are wanting to say. Christians and even these great people of the past are, in a sense, unimpressive. But when you listen to what they say, that is hugely impressive. It's almost that sense that you get in the New Testament documents about treasure in earthen vessels. And that's built upon, because what the apologists will say is the Spirit of God inspires these ancient prophets, inspires people like Moses and Jeremiah. And he comes upon simple folk in the second centuries, simple folk, people unimpressive in themselves. But what they say can only be God taught. And they use images of musical instruments. The Christians are flutes played by God. So it's not that the words that they say are invented by themselves. These are things which God says through them. And the simile, they talk about God, in a sense, being a flautist, playing on a flute, playing on a lyre. Those are some of the arguments. And there's another argument which arises out of the Christian tradition is simple, it's harmonious. It points to there being, in a sense, the one person behind it. There's not discordant voices. In comparison, Justin will say that, and for that matter, Tatian, but they're not alone. They will say, when you look at the cities and towns of the Greco-Roman Empire, you'll find different rules on the same topic. You'll find discordant judgments. You'll find discordant practices. Those are some of the arguments that are being put forward to say, yes, Christianity may be new in one sense, but it's not new in the fuller sense. And it's true partly because it has been tested by time, but actually it's true because it originates from God's revelation in and through his word.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. So we have this sort of ancient pedigree of the faith that it's sort of tested and true, as you said, or tried and true, I guess you could say.
Mm.
And then you have kind of the truthfulness of the faith, right? That they're these apologists are also really adamant to argue for. And obviously these things are interwoven. But what were maybe some of their major arguments in particular for the latter, for sort of the truthfulness of the Christian faith?
Primarily, it's an argument from lifestyle, as it were, that as it were, by your fruits shall you be known. So, in a sense, what is central to the apologists is that what will clinch an argument is a godly life. So there are all the arguments that I've just mentioned about God speaking through simple people and it being um, obvious from what they say, that as with this is treasure in earthen vessels.
Mhm.
But what is more important is that they will say, if you look at the gods of the Greek plays, if you look at what is happening in the amphitheatre, what is being condoned is immorality in the case of the Greek plays. It's about gods fighting one another. In the amphitheatre, it's about the killing of other people. If you look at the issue of unwanted children, which it was occasionally, very sadly, the practice that these children were just left to die. They were exposed to the weather. The apologists severally turn around and say, Christians don't do that. If you look at our lives, we don't engage in incest. We don't engage in cannibalism. Quite the contrary. We are people who look after the poor to the extent that we will even fast, and the money that we might have spent on food or the food that we might have eaten, we give to those who are without. One of my favorite um, um, areas where this is played out is in terms of the matter of the exposing of unwanted children. It is maintained in one of the apologists that two people go out to collect unwanted children. There are people who are pimps who will collect the children, bring them back, nurture them, and then use them as prostitutes in their business. And there are Christians who see in these unwanted children exposed to the elements virtual orphans. And in that tradition of, the Jewish tradition, what do? You look after the widow, you look after the orphan, etc. They will go and they will rescue these people, but they won't rescue them for any other reason than these are young children to be looked after. And in fact, they drive it even harder. That is, the Christians drive it even harder, because they say one of the worst things is we are accused of incestuous behavior. But in fact, what is happening with the pimps rescuing the children laid out to the weather to be exposed and die, is that these people can be rescued by pimps, become prostitutes, and then become prostitutes even to their own parents who are seeking the pleasures of the prostitutes. So if anywhere there is incest being enabled by society which is accusing Christians of incest. And then that's driven a little further, and they say, but we are guilty of promiscuity in one way. And this comes back to the thing about the truth of Christianity in the argument. Because we are promiscuous in that we don't draw boundaries as to who we will help. We will help the poor. We will help the needy. We will help our persecutors, even to the extent that when we are persecuted, just as Jesus forgave his persecutors, so we will forgive others. And why? Not to rub their salt into the wound, but to allow them the possibility of hearing the words of forgiveness and realize that they have done wrong and mend their ways, and therefore not suffer the penalty of the end time which comes to all sinners. So, really, the arguments for the truth of Christianity are driven by these people in terms of a lifestyle to be lived by all, to be not just debated as philosophical schools might debate, but to be lived and engaged and be inclusive.
Mhm. I want to take a bit of a sharp turn, maybe, perhaps, and talk about maybe the place of kind of apophatic theology in some of
Yep.
these thinkers, because you do note that there's maybe a bit of an apophatic streak in the work of Aristides. You
Mm.
mentioned this in the book, so I'm curious, kind of in what ways were he and if the others, other of the apologists were as well, maybe sort of drawing on apophatic styles of theology.
I think I would want to draw a distinction between apophatic theology in the sense of um, not knowing God and using negative definitions of God to distinguish God from um, the material world. So, for example, when I talk about the work of Aristides and perhaps drawing on apophatic theology, yes, he doesn't mention that God is Father or Father of all, and he does describe God as without a beginning, without an end, incorporeal. Now, it seems to me that what is going on here is not wishing to say we don't know God, but wanting to distinguish God from what has a beginning, what has an end, what is corporeal. And it's all bound up with this argument that you should not worship what is made. So for Aristides, by saying God is without beginning, without end, is incorporeal, is not to say that God is distant or unknown, but he is distinct from matter. Indeed, Aristides goes on to say, but God is the mover and maker of all. So there is that sense in which there is a distinction, but there's not alienation of God. The same comes into play with that anonymous letter writer to Diogenetus. He also talks about the invisible maker of all. One of the things which I particularly like with regard to that letter is there is a part of the letter where our unknown letter writer just heaps up titles for God, which in a sense dismiss immediately the sense that apophaticism is not, or negative theology, is not without its fellow partner of cataphatic theology, of positive theology. And that anonymous letter writer says he describes God as nurse, father, counselor, healer, honor, glory, might, life, and other titles. That rich, um, the balancing of nurse with might, of counselor with honor, of healer with life. It's a very rich picture. It's almost poetic in that sense. There's another part where Theophilus, writing in about 180, writing to Autolycus in Antioch, and he talks about God being inimitable in goodness, that he is uncontainable. Now, those at one level sound very negative until you read it alongside his critique of Zeus, the highest god within the um, pantheon of Greek mythology. He says, Zeus can be here, but if he's here, he's not there. And if he's not there, he can't be helping the person who is there, as opposed to the person who's helping here. There is a sense in which Zeus, one of the highest gods, is limited, is contained. In comparison, God, being uncontainable, can be here and here and here and here and here. He can be with you and with me and with that person and the other person. And not only that, because he's illimitable in terms of goodness, the quality of that help and the variety of that help, which someone like Theophilus will be wanting to suggest, is not sort of he doesn't. God doesn't treat people as ciphers, and the answer to everyone's predicament is exactly the same. There's variegation, there's richness, there's mercy that takes different forms. So I think that that apophatic theology, that negative theology, is one which distinguishes God, but doesn't make God distant. There's In Middle Platonism, there's an emphasis on transcendence, but hugely at the expense of the immanence of God. In Gnostic thinking, there's that sense of the flight of the alone to the alone. A person is a cipher, and God just relates to each person in the same way. It's as where religion becomes a technique. This apophaticism is much richer, much more engaged, if I can put it that way.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, I want to take maybe one final sharp turn again, and kind of a final question, which is to talk about how these figures think of the Roman Empire. So, I mean, would it be accurate to say that they see Christianity sort of in opposition with the empire or at odds with it in some way? Or instead, do they see it as maybe in keeping with the empire? In other words, where do they sort of see, or how do they sort of see the Christian faith, its relation to the kind of the reality and the power of the Roman Empire at the time?
Yeah. The exception will be Tatian. Tatian will see virtually nothing good in the Roman Empire, but then he is one of these persons who sees very little good in the material world, whether it's in terms of marriage or in terms of um, Greek philosophy or whatever it happens to be. The other five letter writers are very different from Tatian. They see themselves as maybe it's a bit strong to say critical friends of the empire. They recognize that they are living in a time when the empire in the middle to late 2nd century is peaceful, it's prosperous. Indeed, Irenaeus, who is living between about 130 and 202, maybe, that sort of period anyway, he will read and is a strong Christian speaker of the period, will acknowledge that as a result of Roman law, even Christians can walk the empire's highways in safety. I mean, yes, I grant you that there are occasional outbursts of violence, but generally speaking, what Irenaeus is saying is correct. They want to nevertheless say that within that empire, not everything is good. And they see themselves, the letter writer to Diognetus says that just as the rational soul in the body is the proper directive ordering principle in the body, so your soul or my soul properly will tell the body how to behave in a godly fashion. So Christians are to be, if you wish, the rational soul, God, the godly being in the body, the civic body, in the empire. And another apologist draws attention to the role of the creative word. He's reflecting on the Genesis account of the creative word in Genesis 1. And he says, the creative word brought order to the initial chaos of the of the world which is coming into being. In the same way, that same creative word, that same creative word, through Christians, should be bringing order and well-being to the 2nd century world. So they can be critical, as I have said, they can be critical of the cultic practices. They can be critical of someone like Celsus, who says the emperor is like the paterfamilias. The paterfamilias, the father of the family, is the person whose responsibility it is to bring peace and prosperity and safety and protection to his family. On a much bigger scale, the emperor is the paterfamilias. He is the person who ensures that there is food and security for all. And so he's to be honored, he's to be worshipped, he's to be obeyed. Now, the Christians will turn around on that particular one and say, no, he is to be honored, but he's to be honored because he's been appointed to that position by God, in the same way as all in authority have been put in a position. And they're to be honored and obeyed insofar as they do what is right. So, as I've said, Christians are to pray for the emperor. But they also emphasize that they pay their taxes, they obey good laws, they help the poor, they are for the well-being of society. Where they see unjust laws, they will seek to have them changed. Some of those laws will be laws which are leading to the persecution of Christians. But there are other laws which also need to be changed. And so in that sense, at that time, they are engaging critically with wider society. They want peace and prosperity, but they want it understood in the way that they would see as being what has properly been revealed through the Word of God. And by the Word of God, they mean not Scripture, they mean the Word as in the prologue to the Gospel of John, that Word that in the beginning was with God and was God.
Mhm. Yeah, well, Dr. Pedersen, thank you so much for this conversation. I really enjoyed reading your book, and our listeners, of course, won't be aware that this meeting went through several, well, I think two at least rescheduling. So I just want to say thank you again for your
Not at all.
eminent patience and graciousness as I adjust to doing this work part time. I do want to, as we close, I always like to give our guests a chance to share if they have sort of anything in the pipeline. So do you have any works that are in progress, or anything else that you might like to share about here as we kind of land the plane?
Yes, I've got something at a very preliminary stage, and it's running under the general title of Saying Grace and Living Graciously. I suppose I've become aware, at least within the UK, and I think probably more widely in Europe, that the saying of grace at meals is becoming a very occasional act. It's also sometimes almost a perfunctory act, almost as though it's the starting gun for the meal.
Mm.
Um, and it's also one of those things where, sadly, I think quite often it's addressed to the diners rather than God, and sometimes even to get a laugh from the diners because one has created a witty grace. And at about the same time, I found myself reading the commentary or the letters that Gregory of Nyssa, the fourth century Cappadocian, wrote on the Lord's Prayer. And a particular phrase leapt off the page for me where Gregory says, it's very difficult to eat our daily bread at the expense of others. And that made me think, why is it important to say grace? And if it's important to say grace, should it be something that we just say with our lips? Or should it be something that spills over into the way we live? Should we live thankfully? And so questions such as living responsibly, our daily bread sufficient for the day, should it be seasonal eating? And if it's living responsibly and generously, what about one's neighbor? And in a world where there's such inequality between the global south and the global north, what does it mean for one of the people that is often supplying our food, for them to have sufficient daily bread? And if part of our neighbor is the world, then is sufficient to be related to the well-being of the soil. The soil is our neighbour. I'm very aware of the writing of Norman Fitzbay at Duke and his wonderful writing in that area. And that, of course, then brings in issues about trading justly and buying environmentally well. And also, I suppose the last area that I'm sort of exploring is what I'm at the moment thinking of in terms of feasting convivially, when one's dining with a carnivore and a vegetarian and a vegan. I mean, in the language of the ecumenical debate, do we just live with reconciled diversity? Or do we try and find ways where there's what in ecumenical terms would be termed visible unity? Do we feast convivially when some of the ethics lying behind what we eat and how we find our food are contested? So that's some of the areas that I'm
Mhm.
spending a few moments on.
That sounds delightful. Is this a project that's sort of in the research phase, or is it already written and awaiting publication? Where are you at in the
Oh, no,
process?
no, it's still at the research. I mean, I suppose I've got sort of a couple of introductory chapters, and um, I just need to sort of pick up my pen again and
Sure, sure,
find the minutes
sure.
be-
Absolutely. Yeah,
between
yeah, yeah.
saying grace and eating.
Yeah, there you go. Well, it sounds delightful. I'll be excited to see it come to press. Dr. Pedersen, thank you again so much for our listeners. The book is called The Second-Century Apologists. It's one of our Cascade Companions. But Dr. Pedersen, really appreciate you taking the time to chat to have this very instructive conversation today. So thank you.
It's been a delight to share the conversation and share my ideas. Thank you for your time.